Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to KEI. We have people joining us virtually as well, so I'll give it maybe a few seconds for them to file in, as is the case, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, good morning. My name is Clint Work. I'm a fellow and the Director of Academic Affairs at the Korea Economic Institute, or KEI. And we're very pleased to have everyone here today, both in person and online, for the launch of the inaugural volume of our new flagship journal, Korea Policy. For those who are familiar with or not familiar with KEI's previous work, Korea Policy aims to bring together both the objective and spirit of our previous publications, both our academic paper series on Korea publication, as well as our joint U.S. Korea academic studies publication. And like those previous publications, Korea Policy identifies and explores an array of security, economic, and political issues and policy trends directly related to Korea and the U.S. Korea alliance. And it brings together really academically rigorous, but also policy relevant research. And I do just want to give a special shout out to Dr. Gil Rosman and also Dr. Randall Jones, who are our peer review editors for Korea Policy. And Gil himself has been a longstanding peer review editor for the previous aforementioned publications, and will be sticking with us moving forward. Moving forward, Korea Policy will be published 3 times a year in 3 volumes, and each volume will cover a broad, unifying theme. And there'll be 2 sections in each volume. The first section provides various regional states' perspectives on that broad theme, and the second section is more Korea-focused articles that also fall under that unifying theme. Now, before publication, the articles in the first section are presented as working drafts as part of KEI's new academic symposium series at various universities around the country. And the articles in the second section are presented here at KEI's office. And now our inaugural volume of Korea Policy, which is being released today, runs under the broad theme of rethinking the liberal international order in Asia amidst Russia's war in Ukraine. And the articles in the first section cover the war's impact on thinking about the Indo-Pacific region with the U.S., Japan, South Korea, China, and Russia. And the second section's articles offer a more Korea-centered focus, specifically on the effects of the war on South Korea's economy, on triangular relations between North Korea, China, and Russia, and on South Korea's effort and initiative to become a global pivotal state. And those are the 3 papers that are being presented today at our launch event. And we've got a set of wonderful authors and also discussants with whom they've been paired to dig deeper into each of these papers. To begin with, to my left, we have former South Korean Trade Minister Yaw An-gu, who will present a paper titled The War in Ukraine and Its Implications for the Korean Economy, which he co-authored with Dr. Yeon Won-ho. Former Minister Yaw is a non-resident distinguished fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and as I mentioned, previously served as the trade minister, for the Republic of Korea under the previous Moon Jae-in administration. His co-author, Dr. Yeon Won-ho, is a research fellow and head of the economic security team at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, or KIEP, in South Korea. Their discussant is Dr. Randall Jones, who's a non-resident distinguished fellow here at KEI and a professional fellow at Columbia University's Center on Japanese Economy and Business. Next, Dr. Andrei Lonkoff is presenting his paper titled Restitching the Triangle, North Korean Relations with China and Russia After Ukraine. Dr. Lonkoff is a historian and professor of Korean Studies at Kookmin University in Seoul, South Korea, and a director at NK News, and a wonderful conversationalist, I might add. We're very pleased to have his discussant, Dr. Sumi Terry, director of the Asia program at the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And third, Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo, is presenting his paper From Shrimp to Middle Power to Something More, South Korea as a Global Pivotal State. Dr. Pardo is Professor of International Relations at King's College London and the KF-VUB Korea Chair at the Brussels School of Governance. And his discussant is my colleague and friend, Dr. Darcy Drought, non-resident fellow here at KEI and a postdoctoral research associate at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And just a few brief notes on our run of show. I will pass things off to Trade Minister Ya momentarily. Each of our authors in turn will give a breakdown of the key takeaways from their papers for about 10 or so minutes. After all three have finished, we'll then turn to the discussants who will provide their own 5 to 7 minute feedback and questions based on the papers they've been assigned. We'll then open to a moderated discussion, allowing the authors to respond to the discussants' comments and questions, and then we'll open things up to you, both the in-person audience and the virtual audience. And for those online, we have put the link for Volume 1 of Korea Policy in the chat box, so it's accessible there. And for those in person, we've printed out specifically the 3 papers being featured today, I believe, in the foyer. So if you'd like to pick those up. And I think that's it out of me. So without further ado, Trade Minister Ya.
Yes. Good morning, good evening. It's a really great pleasure and honor to be here. And first, I would like to congratulate on the launch of this flagship Korea journal and wish continued success. And also, thank you for organizing this in-person plus hybrid on this very interesting and the very timely topic. Today, I'd like to discuss the war in Ukraine and how it affected Korean economy. I don't think there's many kind of the papers or articles on geopolitical or political aspect, but not really on this how that affected the Korean economy. But I try to delve into that issue. Korea and Ukraine is really far away. I mean, in fact, exactly opposite side of the huge Eurasia continent, thousands of miles away. But I would say that in terms of economic impact, the war really has had significant impact on the Korean economy through direct and as well as indirect the channel. The first, in terms of this indirect channel, I think it was mostly through this macroeconomic parameter, especially through this global energy price, spike. If you look at this, Korean economy, we are heavily, depend on energy import from overseas. So we import over like 90-20% of our energy from overseas market, and in fact, the Korea's the exposure to Russia in terms of our energy import from Russia is quite small. I mean, if you look at this crude oil, it's only 4.5%, and Russia is 8th largest importing partner for Korea, and LNG is a 5%, and 7th largest the importing partner. But this coal and enriched uranium for the civilian nuclear power production, that is sort of an exception, and we heavily depend on Russia. Coal, 20.20%, and 2nd largest importing partner. And enriched uranium, it's a 30.9%, which is the first. But the volume-wise, it's not really significant. But in terms of price increase triggered by this, the war in Ukraine has had significant impact on Korea. Oil, crude oil and LNG and coal each increased after the war 39%, 128%, and 161% respectively. So you can imagine how that could take a toll on this the balance sheet of Korea's trade. So since the April 2022, which is right after the war in Ukraine, Korea has recorded the trade deficit for the first time in 14 years, right? And then resulting in $47.2 billion of trade deficit. Let me give another number of how much this energy import in the 3 key energy sources increased during that period. It increased $78.4 billion. So it was much more this energy import, the value-wise increased much bigger than this trade deficit, annual trade deficit we record is, which means that we had huge trade deficit in the energy import, but also we kind of compensated with a surplus in manufacturing and other sectors. So that was the main kind of negative impact through these macroeconomic parameters. Now let me elaborate on the more direct, the link of the war to the Korean the economy. The first, supply chain in the critical raw materials. Especially the Ukraine and Russia have had really oversized role in terms of the semiconductor, the rare gas, the supplies in the semiconductor industry, which is essential for this high precision, this manufacturing process, especially the lithography process. So, for example, neon, krypton, xenon. I was really bad in chemistry when I was school, but I had to memorize this neon, krypton, and xenon. But it's almost 20 or 30% of the import. The supply being with the Korean companies rely on these two countries, and then to make things worse, Russia imposed this export restriction on these critical the rare gases to these unfriendly countries, including Korea. So this is really interesting statistic. But for example, neon, the price increased by 52 times. During one of the peak times, 52 times, and the value-wise, the total import soared 300 times. So you can imagine how much the supply chain shock was caused by this war in Ukraine. But I think it was about a few months after the Korea has gone through huge supply chain shock, which was the urea in November 2021. So I think that the Korean private sector as well as Korean government was a bit better prepared in this time. So I think the Korean companies really scrambled to the build up the stockpiles, and then also really intensified effort to internalize the sourcing of those critical rare gases domestically, and partly succeeded. So there was, I think, good lesson that we learned from this series of the supply chain shock. The second, export control, and also its impact on this Korea's investment in Russia. Right after the war broke out, the U.S. really led this international coalition to impose the strictest and the most sweeping measures of export control against Russia, including 57 this kind of non-strategic items from semiconductor, electronics, and the sensors, etc. And Korea joined about the week later, but I think it caused huge controversy in Korea. But actually, I was in that office during that time, and what I can say is that it was a bit learning period for Korea because Korea's export control regime is completely aligned with this four multilateral this export control regime, including this 1996 FARA, this export control regime. But our system wasn't really designed nor equipped to deal with this independent export control measures on this non-strategic item. So I think we had to do a lot of internal, consultation, and also the negotiation with the U.S. counterpart, etc. But I think the public support for Korea's joining this big cause was so strong among publics, the general public, that I think Korea was able to move swiftly to join the similar level of this export control during the time. But I think it is also good, the improvement, I believe, because in 2014, during this Crimea situation, Korea didn't join this export control at that time. But obviously, time has changed. Korea's place in the world has radically changed. So I think Korea really tried to live up to that the renewed role in the international stage. Third, this energy exposure I explained previously, so I'll skip to the defense industry, the fourth point. I think this war in Ukraine really waken up Korea to the new reality that Korea has really strong competitive advantage in this arms and ammunition and this defense industry. And in 2022, this arms export really hit the record level of $17.4 billion of export, which pushed Korea to this 8th largest exporter of these arms and defense industry. So this is a big leapfrog, and we believe that there's a huge potential commercially as well, and also industry-wise, because Korea has all this manufacturing ecosystem in place to really excel in this defense industry. But the challenge is that, as many the international newspaper reported recently, that Korea is under pressure to be able to aid directly to countries in conflict, and so now it's it's not a matter of the legislation, but Korea is not allowed to to provide direct these arms sales to countries in war. So that is kind of big test to remain. So lastly, some of the lessons take away. The first, supply chain resilience. I think through this series of supply chain resilience, I think Korea learned hard way that the government and business sector, the importance of this supply chain resilience and the private and public partnership. In case of urea that I mentioned, our dependence on that one of the one raw material on China was more than 95%. But in this case of rare gases, it was 17 to 31%. But I mean, it is really critical where the raw materials, and really cannot overemphasize the critical nature of this. So I believe also we need international, the collective responses to cope with this the supply chain shock. I mean, no other countries can do it on its own. So IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, would be one of the I think promising the platform to deal with. But also I think government really is kind of developing its policy responses to to find the right way to intervene with this visible hand to rectify the problem caused by this invisible hand in the market. And secondly, energy security and energy transition. I think this is an area we see a really stark difference between how EU responded and how Korea responded. I recently traveled to Europe, and I was really inspired by how this European, it really turned this crisis into opportunity to really push through the renewable energy and then big green energy transition. And I heard many Europeans jokingly says that the Putin is a great contributor to this green big transition in Europe. Mainly because European exposure of this Russian gas was huge, right? But unfortunately, in Korea, fortunately or unfortunately, as I said, our exposure to Russia in energy was quite small, and the impact was normally through this the global energy price high. So it didn't really push up us to really, to this energy transition, which I believe badly needed in Korea. So that is one big difference. Lastly, I'd like to conclude that the war in Ukraine was, I think, good testing ground for Korea to really step up and embrace the bigger role needed of Korea as a really new global leader. But I think it was also sort of learning experience for Korea. Going forward, Korea really needs to recognize the expectation and responsibility of Korea as a new global leader. But I also believe that the world needs to provide suitable platform for Korea to play such a role. So, for example, this IPEF is I think is an imminent platform that Korea can play a really leading role, but also Quad, for example, and G7. I mean, without Korea, I mean, it's really difficult to have substantive discussion in this sensitive technology, critical, supply chain and technological standard, etc. So I think it is time for really to, really consider, inviting Korea to these international fora. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. That last point Ramon's work and paper wonderfully dovetails with that point of South Korea taking an increased role and responsibilities. But before we get to Ramon, Dr. Longkov.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And second, well, I would say that we are now facing a completely new world. And personally, I don't find it's a pleasant place to live. But I strongly suspect that decision makers in North Korea have a dramatically different opinion on this issue. Probably they actually like the new world. Because it basically has confirmed all their early expectations, and it creates an ideal environment where North Korean leaders can exist indefinitely. Basically, I think that Ukrainian war is a relatively secondary event compared to conflict between United States and China. From the North Korean point of view, Ukraine is important, but the Second Cold War, if I can say so, between China and the United States is very, very, very important. Because, in a sense, we see the revival of the old situation which existed quite briefly from the late 1940s to the early 1960s, when there was an alliance, a sort of quasi-alliance. Technically, it was, de facto alliance between the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea. We have now a revival of the same triangle, which is China, Russia, and North Korea. It's a difficult triangle because there is very little actual solidarity in this alliance. But I can tell you, back in the 1950s, there was also a great deal of distrust between the same three parties. And I don't see the situation is now, I think the situation is worse than it used to be half a century ago, but not much worse. Nonetheless, as I have said, for North Korea, it's a very good news. Why? Because in the past, North Koreans had to maneuver between China, United States, South Korea, to some extent Japan and Russia, trying to squeeze as much aid as possible, giving as little as possible in terms of concessions. Because their policy for 70 years was largely about getting aid from the outside world as much as possible, giving as little as possible in return. And they have demonstrated themselves to be really good manipulators and diplomats. I would say very good. But having said that, the situation where they existed since the end of the Cold War was inherently unstable because they depended on the next elections in South Korea, they depended on the changes of mood in Washington, and so on. And now they have stability, and stability is good. What's actually changed with the Sino-US conflict? Chinese used to have a rather ambivalent approach to North Korea. They did not like North Korea's nuclear ambitions because China is much interested in maintaining the non-proliferation regime. And North Korea was undermining non-proliferation regime. North Korea was quite provocative in many other regards. They did not usually consider Chinese interests, and their actions very often were either reasons or pretext for maintaining or maybe even increasing the US military presence in the region, and China did not like it. On top of that, there was a great deal of ideological dislike. So just 10 years ago, 12 years ago, China was willing to consider a future without North Korea. There were at least track 2 talks between sort of not negotiations, just consultations around 2009, 2008 between the US and China about, not I say academics, let's say, track 2, what to do if North Korea goes down in flame, and China was obviously willing to accept, and China did send some signals, they were willing to accept unification under South Korean control if Chinese interests are taken into account. It's ancient history by now, ancient history. Because with the confrontation with the United States, the value of North Korea as a buffer zone is decisive. They are willing to, they still don't like North Korean regime. They still find it comical and disgusting. They still worry about nuclear weapons and so on, but it's irrelevant. They need a buffer zone. They cannot afford this kind of civil war anarchy in a nuclear-armed country nearby. And even less enthusiasm China feels about possible unification of Korea under control of South Korea, which will be, let's face it, not unification but conquest of the North by the South. Maybe with support, at least initially, by a majority of the North Korean population, but still. They don't want to deal with an enlarged version of South Korea, which is democratic, nationalistic, pro-American state. So they need buffer zone, and they are willing to close their eyes on what's going on. And hence we have the situation when China has reasons to do what they are doing, that is to ship unconditional aid. If you like, North Korea now is getting basic income. You know this major idea about a new approach to basically you're just paid because you are alive and human. Yes, so say they are having the same unconditional support, not much. China is not going to subsidize North Korean economic miracle because China does not need an economic miracle. Excessively powerful, successful North Korea will become difficult to deal with. The level is subsistence. Some people here might have access to some classified stuff, but even without classified stuff, I can see very easily that Chinese aid is provided. If you look at the prices at fuel and prices at food at the North Korean markets, which are stable, and North Korea does not produce food, so it doesn't produce fuel, and the fuel price is stable. Food prices, grain prices increased marginally, so there are some problems for poorer sectors, poorer North Koreans to get food, but basically there's also relatively stable and it indicates that shipments from China are coming, and I'm pretty sure they will continue to come. American hopes occasionally that it will be somehow possible to persuade China to stop this aid, because in the end of the day, China doesn't want North Korea to further undermine non-proliferation regime, I believe these expectations are not realistic. Yes, China is not happy about it, but on balance, they need a buffer zone, and this is a big news. North Koreans are getting aid, which comes without much dependency, because they understand they are paid is basic income. They are paid just to exist. And they can basically, within certain red lines, ignore Chinese interests as they used to do, challenge it. And I'm pretty sure right now they are hunting for trying to do everything possible to minimize Chinese penetration of their politics. And what is telling that they are trying to finally get the final solution of the Hwayo issue inside North Korea. Out of 5,000 Chinese citizens who have permanent residence rights in North Korea, well over half are actually now in China. On paper, there are 5,000, really maybe 2,000 or so. And they were always a problem. The only statistically significant group of foreigners who could reside inside the country. And they didn't like it. So all this type of things, they are sort of pushed aside. And now where does Ukraine come? When there is no such a thing as an excessive defense. Personally, I don't believe that Russia is going to provide North Korea with aid on the scale comparable with China. Partially because, let's not forget, Russia has an economy roughly size of Spain and Italy. And yes, sanctions Russia is facing have been so far remarkably inefficient. But in the long run, most likely Russian economic situation is not going to improve. And even now, with the current size of the Russian economy, it's difficult to provide much. Yes, maybe buying something, selling something, maybe sort of symbolic aid, but if you look at the scale of, say, food aid, when the World Food Program used to run database, they closed now, you could see that Russian aid, food aid was roughly 50 times smaller than Chinese food aid to North Korea, roughly the same difference. Nonetheless, Russia is also useful because first of all, it's possible some access to military technology, especially if there will be shipments of South Korean arms to Ukraine. There might be some kind of, revenge, if you like. But what is more important, it's yet another vote in the Security Council of the United Nations. It's good to have Chinese support. It's better to have two supporting great powers. And for North Korea, this aid comes very cheaply because what Russia expects is just that North Korean diplomats will occasionally vote against resolutions which are critical of Russia, which is basically, well, it costs nothing to North Korea anyway, and in exchange they get basically a Russian vote, which is blocking something quite important. So they exchange just broad smiles for something significant, which is once another proof that they are very good diplomats, even that in this case they are lucky. And the question is that this situation, in spite of a great deal of mutual distrust, dislike, and everything, is probably lasting. Because I don't see any end, any prospects for Sino-US confrontation ending in the foreseeable future. It's probably for decades. And as long as this confrontation exists, China will need North Korea as a buffer zone. North Korea will get this unconditional aid. And, well, they are quite happy about it because it doesn't really come with dependency. Russia is a more complicated issue, but for the foreseeable future, I believe that Russia will remain as a part of the bloc, as a junior partner of China, increasingly sucked into the Chinese sphere of influence, which means that yes, it will keep a kind, or it will remain a kind of the secondary player. So for North Korea, its survival, this geopolitical spring has finally come. They have survived a long 3 decades of long geopolitical winter when they nearly gone extinct, but now the Kim family can look at future with confidence and groom this young, bright girl to become the first female dictator of North Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lonkoff.
Nice and cheery.
Thank you, Dr. Lonkoff. It's like the more things change, the more they return to the same. I've never heard Chinese aid to North Korea framed as universal basic income, but that's
But
an
it's
interesting
how it works.
take. Yeah,
It's how it
UBI.
works, basically.
UBI. Okay, Ramon, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And as you said, my paper focuses on security, on politics, but it dovetails with the first presentation that we had that focused more on economics. And it has three main parts, which I link to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because I do agree with the point raised that this has come as a point in time when expectations about what South Korea could be doing have changed, have shifted. And of course, in my case, I come from Europe, so we have war in our continent. And if I compare, for example, with the invasion of Crimea that was mentioned before, it's day and night, right? The type of expectations that my European perspective will have about what Korea might be doing. And the first point that I make is this one, right? That as Korean capabilities have been increasing, economic, technological, but also as we have seen recently, also in the defense sector, for example, there are more requests coming not only obviously from the U.S., the long-standing ally of Korea, but also from countries that maybe in the past would have an economic relationship with Korea that now is moving in a separate direction, which is not only economics, but also security, diplomacy as well, and technology. There is expectations that South Korea will use these resources. And we have seen this very clearly with the invasion of Ukraine. We have seen Poland, of course, the agreement that everybody knows. They are still with South Korea. But then you have Norway, you have Estonia, now you have Romania as well, negotiating an agreement with Korea. You see Turkey, for example, also negotiating an agreement with Korea. And it's quite interesting because if you see the discussion that we have in Brussels, in London, in different European capitals, is how we can deliver for Ukraine, to give Colin with this example, as quickly as possible, right? And the two countries that always come up in discussions are Korea and Israel, but Korea has a stronger defense industry than Israel, right? And is able to deliver more quickly and in larger quantities. So the point that I try to make is that I do agree that Korean mentality has changed, right? And it's becoming more global, more looking at these global issues. But partly this is driven by the growing demand on Korea itself that in the past may not have been there, but now clearly is there. We had the U.S. Korea summit a few days ago. Here in the U.S. and in Europe, for example, there was a lot of focus on the economic security component as well, right? So you see European leaders, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, they went to Korea late last year, asking similarly to the US for a Samsung factory, right? Why don't you build factories here in Europe as well, right? So there are these different dimensions in terms of engagement with Korea, in this case, directly related to economic security. We have French President, for example, Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Scholz as well, the two biggest EU economies. They're going to be traveling to Korea in the coming months as well. So this is across the board and across different sectors that are growing demands on Korea. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine illustrates this. Which takes me to the second point, which is the global dimension of Korean foreign policy. And certainly the U.S.-Korea alliance has not been about North Korea for a long period of time. But if you look beyond this alliance, right, and if you look at relations that Korea may have with Europe, with Canada, with Australia, for example, I'm writing a paper for the Canadian embassy. They're very keen on the Canadian in Seoul, the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, how it can lead to cooperation with the Korean Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, right? So it's not only Europe looking at these other countries as well. And there's this focus on looking beyond Northeast Asia, looking beyond East Asia as a whole, and what can be done at the global level, especially by these countries that think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has a global dimension. We all know that not all countries agree with this. Some countries, India, for example, think this is a European conflict, but clearly there are many other countries, the US, Europe, Korea, Japan, Australia, Canada, that think no, this is a global conflict. And you see this focus not only because President Jung himself now is talking about the global pivotal state, but also because other countries want to see what can be done with Korea beyond the Korean Peninsula and as I said, Northeast Asia and East Asia as a whole. And this takes me to the point that Mr. Yo made as well, right? That this leads to demands coming from the Korean side as well. G7, for me, the crucial one, right? Korea for the third time in four years is being invited to the G7 summit, right? The US invited it, of course, it didn't happen the summit, but then the UK came along and now Japan as well. Canadian counterparts indicate that Canada will also invite Korea to the G7 summit when it's hosted in Canada, right? So what you see here is that, from my perspective, Korea is also in a position to be able to ask other countries, what does it get in return? And this is, of course, self-interested, but there's a self-interest component. There's the component of cooperating with so-called like-minded partners, but there is also the interest of self-interest on the part of Korea. Quad is another example that was mentioned before, IPEF. But what I find interesting is that if you look at this again from where I see it, from a European dimension, there is also this belief that Korea, Australia especially, right? Japan, of course, is already part of the G7. They should be part of this fora, right? Because from a European perspective, they may be seen as too Western-centric, right? And this might create frictions with other countries. They will say, well, these are the Europeans and the Americans, right, telling the rest of the world what they should be doing. So from this perspective, the more countries you can integrate with which you have no political problems, and in Europe, the Korea and Japan are the two that I mentioned together. If we look at Asia, Australia, it depends who you ask, because, you know, France has some frictions with Australia now because of AUKUS, but some other countries are keen on working with Australia. But Korea and Japan are the two that are always mentioned, right? So as an example, we have a project with NATO on NATO AP4 cooperation. My colleagues are right now actually in Australia as part of this project. And if you look at NATO, of course, the US is part of NATO, but the European countries that are part of NATO, they always mention these two countries, right? Korea and Japan as the two we should be working with. Which takes me to the final point, which is what are the implications for Korea in a context in which we see growing rivalry between the US and China. And for me, it's interesting because obviously I don't come from the US, I don't come from China. So it's a question that we're constantly discussing in the EU level, in the UK, in France, when you talk to different European countries. And of course, each country, plus the EU itself, have different approaches to this. Some, like Germany, are maybe transitioning to a position which is closer to the US. Other countries have already made that transition. But what is interesting is that this is a point of constant discussion with Korean counterparts, also of course with Japan or with Australia, with other countries as well. But it's a constant point of discussion. I think from our perspective, what we are seeing is Korea leaning quite openly actually towards the US side. And I think the joint statement between Presidents Biden and June was quite clear in this respect. It was noted in Europe, we discussed this before, that Ukraine was very prominently featured, right? It's not a East Asian issue or a Korean Peninsula issue. It is an issue that has global implications, but is happening in Europe, the invasion of Ukraine, right? And this is what I think more and more Europeans are noticing, that Korea is moving towards the US side, of course, strengthening relations with Japan, very clear for anyone to see as well. And sometimes we forget, but Korea also has strong relations with Australia that in a sense precede, for example, in the military domain, the relations that Korea is now building with Europe. And there are questions in Europe about what are the implications about this, not only for Korea itself, right, which I discuss in the paper, but it would take me too much time, but also what does this mean for cooperation with Korea? Again, beyond the US that has alliance with Korea. And I think what we are, the position that you see more and more European policymakers taking is that Korea having a more clear pro-US role is actually beneficial for Europe because most European countries are moving in the same direction, right? And again, the more the merrier, right? If it was only Europe cooperating with the US, there will be some European countries that will have some doubts, right? But if you have Korea, Japan, Australia, potentially other countries as well, Canada of course as well, you do see from Europe this makes it easier. And my impression is that it is the same for Korea. So to finalize, I'll give one specific example. The European Union is about to launch, it has approved a coordinated maritime presence, which is essentially an EU-wide naval mission with the different EU member states providing as much as they can their ships for this mission in what is essentially the South China Sea. It's called, I think we call it Northwestern Indian Ocean. I don't know how we call it, but something. It is the South China Sea, right? And from a European perspective, of course, this will mean cooperation with the US Navy for sure, right? But now the EU is going to Korea, to Japan, to Australia, to India as well, to say, why don't you cooperate with us? Why don't you send your ships? We have joint exercises, maybe period of navigation operations, right? Because it goes back to the point that I make that Europeans feel more comfortable if other countries are involved in this as well. And in my view, the Korean position is the same. So I'll leave it there for my initial introduction. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramon. And just a reminder, as we turn to our discussants, please turn the microphones in your directions. We make sure we catch all the audio. And we will go.
My presentation.
We will go down in the same order, taking again all the discussants' comments and questions, and then we'll open to a discussion. Randall.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Minister Yo, for this interesting paper, a very important topic. And thank you to Clint and KEI for this launch of this new publication. I'd like to focus on the issues of supply chain and also energy security. In my 30 years of dealing with the Korean government, well, at the OECD, the topic of supply chains never came up. I left OECD in 2019, but in July of that year, we had the Japanese decision to limit exports of 3 items that were necessary for semiconductors to Korea. And that was the first time this really became a front page issue, at least from my perspective. And then, of course, we had the problem with urea. I was in Seoul in November of 2021, and I had a meeting with the Blue House with the economic officials, looking forward to talking about exciting things like fiscal policy and productivity. And we spent 80% of our time talking about urea, which I knew nothing about since I flunked chemistry. And then we had the question of Ukraine. So I think you've covered this very well. As a traditional free trade economist, I have very mixed feelings about the shift from efficiency towards security and defense. And I think Minister Yo really summarizes this very well. He said the question is how the government can intervene and to what extent in areas that have been left to the invisible hand in the market to make sure that resilience in the supply chain is secure for national and economic security. So our integrated global economy has made these very efficient supply chains that are efficient, but on the other hand, very fragile. And so how do we cope with that? And Minister Yo points out as well that it can be very expensive to intervene in these finely tuned supply chains. He wrote, the challenge is that such a transition from supply chain efficiency to supply chain resilience and security will inevitably be accompanied by additional cost and inflationary pressure across the supply chains with the buildup of domestic production, stockpiles and inventories, and redundant outsourcing, and this doesn't fit with profit maximizing businesses. So far we've met these 3 crises in Korea, and I think overall Korea has come out very well. But looking ahead, we can see many threats along the same lines. Looking at KEDA data, there are 12,586 imported goods to Korea, where one country accounts for more than 80% of the shipments, indicating a high degree of vulnerability. 12,850 in total, and 3,941 was 80% or higher. So that means 1/3 of the imports were subject to control by one country. If you look at the question of who's supplying these, China accounted for most of these, about 1,850 materials out of the 3,600, and U.S. had 503, and Japan 438. So those three countries account for most of it. So what can we see in the future? Well, magnesium is a potential problem. China provides about, I think, 90% of magnesium to Korea, and we need magnesium to build cars, mobile phones, batteries, three big Korean exports. So we can see this problem could come up in even more serious situations. So my question is, how far has the government advanced in creating a framework that's capable of preparing beforehand to these supply chain disruptions? When we talked to President Moon's government, they had certain plans on paper, and I don't think any of them passed the National Assembly. But I'm interested in hearing your view on what the government could do to a priori or beforehand try to deal with these problems. So one thing would be, what should be the threshold? 80%? If you look at the rare gases, as you pointed out, the Ukrainian share was only 17% to 31%. So you can't simply look and say the import share is high, because it depends on the importance of the product as well. So it requires a lot of judgment what areas are particularly vulnerable. And if you want to respond in advance, what do? Do you focus on import diversification? For me, that would be the best approach, the least costly approach. Korea joining the TPP would be one way to further diversify Korea's trade and prevent too much reliance on single exporters. Then we have the question of stockpiling and domestic production. But that requires either subsidies or trade protection, and that is costly and inefficient. Finally, as Minister Yo mentioned, we need to have this close cooperation between the government and the private sector. Of course, Korea was built on close cooperation between the government and the private sector, but over time, these chaebol are no longer Korean organizations to some extent. They're international organizations who do not necessarily want to listen to the government. So this would be a complicated maneuver, how the government is going to intervene to try to improve the situation. And finally, this will require cooperation between countries, and I think maybe more international discipline on export controls, what Japan did in 2019 would be useful. That issue went to the WTO. Since the WTO has no more power or any boards to resolve these issues, it has basically been dropped. Finally, a word about energy security. I agree very much that Europe had the shock, and that moved them to quickly go in the direction of more renewables and what have you. And Korea didn't have that shock. But I would argue that Korea needs to have that shock. If you look at the goal, by 2030, Korea made a commitment to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 40% relative to 2018. That is a very ambitious target. It was upgraded by Moon Jae-in, and President Yoon has kept that target. To reach that target, Korea has a plan to raise renewables from 6% of power generation in 2018 to 30%. And 2030 is just 7 years away. They want to cut coal from 42% down to 21%. So Korea does need a shock. It's a shame that this Ukrainian shock wasn't enough, but hopefully there will be a shock that will help Korea to make this very rapid transition to achieve its goal of cutting emissions by 40%. So let me stop there and thank you once again for this excellent paper.
Thank you, Randall. I saw, Minister Yo, you've taken copious notes and you're ready to spring into action and respond. But I do want to insist that we go down and get all our discussants' comments before we do so. So, Dr. Terry.
Okay, thanks to KEA for having me here today and for this rollout event for Korea policy, and giving me the easiest job in the world, which is to be a discussant and commentate on anything that Andrei Lenkov writes. So I'll just give you a headline. I agree with everything that Dr. Lenkov said. His extremely cheerful assessment. So I'm just going to highlight just a few points and follow up with a few questions. So I thought this was an excellent paper in terms of just giving also an overview of China's very ambivalent and complex attitude towards North Korea, which I don't think many people fully appreciate because they think it's like they simplify it, but it's quite complex. So in his paper, he begins with a historical overview of this very initial decade of unstable Russia, North Korea, China triangle, and how North Korea positioned and navigated between China and Russia. And because he is a historian, in addition to being an insightful commentator, so I think that was helpful to have this background for those people who are reading it, and sort of how North Korea have successfully maneuvered or manipulated, you use the word manipulated, historically between former Soviet Union and China, trying to really use the differences between these two rival giants to its own advantage. So it talks about Kim Il-sung, you know, how he methodically purged influential members from various factions, including from the Soviet Union faction and the Chinese faction, and so on. And then how Kim Il-sung followed his own independent policy, posture, and then conducted this ideological inspection of unreliable elements. And as you mentioned in the paper, Dr. Lenkov mentions in the paper, really ruthlessly purged those suspected of being too close to Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and China. And then he also eloquently highlights how China, which does not like North Korea's nuclear weapons, but nevertheless values stability. This, many of us know this, but he talks about it, right? And you use this phrase that's many commonly knows as 3 no's: no war, no instability, no nukes, and in that order. I also use that phrase often just because it captures exactly their priority because it's in that order, right? And then again, the whole point about how China needs a buffer zone in North Korea. We don't need to elaborate on that, period. That's what China, particularly now. And then Dr. Lenkov wrote notes in the paper how Russia's goals are pretty much similar that of China. No instability, no war, no instability, no nukes. But the difference between Russia and, of course, China is that to North Korea, Russia is just not that valuable or that's as China. In any case, the 3 no's, right, the no war, no instability, no nukes, in fact, in part explains what happened in the fall of 2017 in the Trump's fire and fury, rocket man on a suicide mission, maximum pressure era, where we did see China do more, and Russia too, in terms of implementing sanctions, right? But as Dr. Lenkov notes in the paper, that unity and that was short-lived. And I agree with that. 2023 is not, when was that? 2017. We live in a very different environment, post-symmetry, post-diplomacy in 2018, 2019, because in 2017, Xi Jinping had never met with Kim Jong-un, right? But post that symmetry and diplomacy, post-U.S.-China competition and rivalry, and post-Ukraine, we're in a very different era. So today, North Korea and China and North Korea and Russia are obviously in closer alignment, although Russia's aid to North Korea is smaller than that of China. But concern here, and Dr. Lenkov mentions this in the paper, is the North Korean labor experts, which you get into a little bit, and how that is likely to expand. So that's very concerning because in the near future, we should expect that North Korean workers will be employed in Russia in large numbers. So I also thought it was very interesting that you note that to make the UNSC sanctions violations less noticeable, you talk about how these labor workers could be issued student visas or visitors visas to get around that. Bottom line, external environment is favorable for North Korea. I cannot agree more with that. We've seen it last year with some 100 tests or 70 ballistic missile tests, no complete paralysis from UNSC. So what is to stop from Kim Jong-un from just continuing down this path? There's absolutely no repercussion that's significant. So for a few questions for you, you mentioned that given the removal of sanctions on North Korea are highly unlikely, we're not going to get any help from China and Russia. So even though China will not be able to invest heavily in North Korea, you talk about that no economic miracle, China cannot do that, but it will still continue to do what it can China will to keep North Korea afloat. So the question is, barring this any kind of unrealistic fantasy deal, you briefly mentioned North Korea for Taiwan thing, which is fantasy from my perspective. You call it prohibitive. Barring that, is there anything that U.S. can do to get China to enforce sanctions more strictly? Question. And assuming the answer is no, and China refuses to do so, then what are our options for any kind of sanctions enforcement? Or should we just give up on that? And how would you also overall assess our options, the Biden administration's options, or even administration's options, and as the U.S. deals with North Korea, given China and Russia's support of North Korea, and given, as you aptly write, this externally favorable environment for North Korea, what are we left with in terms of what the policy options that we should pursue? And then you talk a lot about China's, your view of China towards North Korea, this whole China-North Korea. What about, I wonder, China's view of South Korea? I wonder if you can just pivot a little bit, just because it's still, it matters. China is still South Korea's #1 trading partner, but relations have deteriorated, China, South Korea, somewhat. And there is now interest in friendshoring supply chains out of China. So what's the outlook there? And then I would say last question, which didn't come up, but since very recently there was this Washington Declaration and so on, how do you think China is reacting to that? And then just the future, either how China sees the whole extended deterrence bid, and about South Korea either going nuclear or the whole bringing tactical nuclear weapons back to South Korea. What's whole China's view on this? I have some other questions, but my time is up, and I gave you a bunch of questions. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. And in the interest of time, let's just jump right to Darcy.
Thank you. First, I want to thank KEI and Clint for this opportunity to discuss Rumain's excellent paper, and congratulate you on the launch of your new journal. That's a big endeavor. So I guess my starting point, I don't want to spend too much time summarizing your paper, but the kind of main focal point is to take seriously, I think, the Yoon administration's global pivotal state idea, right? And I appreciate how much you take seriously, like, what is a middle power? How does Korea envision itself a middle power? What is middle powerism, right? And how does Korea do that worldwide? I saw you mentioned MICTA. Yes. Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia, yeah. Which I haven't heard in about a decade. And so it was interesting, though, right, to kind of rethink what does Korea mean globally. This is not the first time that Korea has thought about its role as a middle power, right? You can go back to maybe the Kim Yong-san administration and Segewa, its globalization strategy, right? Interacting, the Lee Myung-bak had a global Korea. Under the Park Geun-hye administration, it was different, but I don't know if it was the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, NAPSI, right? So I guess my first question is how is the global political pivotal state different? Mm-hmm. Is it because of structural issues, perhaps, geopolitical, a security balance, the global economy, as we've talked about a lot in this panel? And then maybe it's something about the Yoon administration specifically, its own interests, its own goals. Perhaps this is linked to this critical junction of the Ukraine, which is, again, another theme of this panel. Is there a sense of the urgency, something that's quite striking, I think, if you hear around town here in Seoul, the inevitability, the urgency of a Taiwan contingency, previously undiscussed, right, in such explicit terms by Koreans. So that's my first question, general question. Another part of your paper is to think about how can Korea punch above its weight as a middle power. These policy recommendations are not easy, especially committing the political will, the economic or security capital. You go over this in your paper quite well. I highly recommend you consider it. You take a look at this, and it's a clear roadmap, I think, for South Korea to commit to these sorts of endeavors. But the question that I want to ask, and this is kind of my bigger question, it's an extension of your paper, is why would Korea want to punch above its weight? And can it do so even politically? Mm-hmm. So what I mean is not just strategically, but in its own self-interest as a democracy with various interest groups vying for influence. When I say interest groups, I don't just mean public opinion polls or civil society, but also interest groups within government, right? How do these interact? I think we're increasingly understanding that the common assumptions that we think about Korean politics are going away. Partisan lines are not as it's not as direct indicators about policy commitments or strategic commitments, right? When Moon Jae-in came into government, we assumed that there was going to be maybe a resurgence of anti-Americanism, different North Korea policy that ended up, I think, happening, closer work with the United States in many respects for a progressive administration. And then we're also seeing younger generations in South Korea have different political opinions. And so I guess to think about these sorts of questions of political will, there's a lot of difficulties here. And this is a much more difficult question, I think. So I want to, particularly point out the rapid and social and economic changes that have occurred that are driving these questions of what is party politics in South Korea, and ideology, social change, generation change, right? Which we really do need to take seriously as younger Koreans take leadership roles. So first, in the political and economic spheres, as I mentioned before, there's much more shades of gray in how South Korea is thinking about its neighbors. And I also wonder what that means, and something that your paper aptly does is think about how Koreans, not just younger Koreans, but Koreans in general, are thinking about its global role. So, you introduce South Korea's relationships with Europe, which I know in Washington, I think we don't discuss enough. There's more cultural affinity than we think of, right? Korea is more global. It has been for 2-3 decades now, right? Level in social, social people to people and economic integration, those kinds of questions. Then the big one that I think is lingering under this when we talk about political will is in the domestic economic sphere. There is, and what kind of pressures there's going to be in Korea to rethink these kinds of questions about friendshoring and right, because there's a self-interest at home. There's actually increasing economic inequality. It was a long country of the middle class, but actually the numbers are changing, right? And that's a voting issue now. That's a very big voting issue now, up there with foreign policy questions. Household debt in South Korea under age of 30, it went up 40% last year among Koreans under 30, which is a remarkable jump considering as a whole, it was 4%. So we see younger Koreans having this big sense of economic urgency. So when we think about global relations, what does that mean? So actually this is all kind of leading to the big question of your paper, the title of your paper, which is From Sherm to Middle Power to Something More. So what does this mean for something more? When we think about the changing domestic political landscape, how does that relate to the global, not just kind of in the, I'm sure there's a lot of political science majors in this room, not just the Putnam 2-level game, but really in the sense of like transnational networks and interconnectedness. So I think that's the kind of extension that I'd like to hear your response on. Thanks.
Thank you, Darcy. We had the complexity of geopolitics and strategy and the global economy, and you had to go ahead and add domestic politics to it. So thanks for making it even more complex. So, Minister Ya, I might just ask, we never want to assume knowledge, even though I think this is an informed audience. Could you do this in the paper, but could you just briefly describe what the urea crisis was for those who don't know?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jones. It's really critical and also excellent questions that, for the audience, this urea crisis hit Korea in November 2021. Urea is just low-end, just one of commodity raw materials. But in Korea, these diesel vehicles, including all the trucks and then emergency vehicle, they are required to have this urea solution to really the reduce greenhouse emissions. So this is kind of essential material to have all these truck fleet going. But what happened was at that time the Chinese government they introduced all of a sudden the export restriction on this urea, and then it began to the ripple effect really began to hit Korea. So in the market, this urea really dried up, and then market really panicked, and then Korea faced a really crisis situation in which this urea could, could be gone in a few days, a matter of few days time. In which case, the millions of truck fleet could stop. And then imagine that in this online shopping era, all this truck fleet could stop any day, or including this emergency vehicle. How chaotic that could be in our daily lives, and also to the government and politically, and etc. So that has been a really big wake-up call to Korea to really let us realize the importance and the vulnerability of this the supply chain shock. We realized that more than 96-7% of urea the supplies, we were depending on China, and also there were a few private sector companies involved in this industry, but they weren't really prepared for any of this kind of contingency. So in a nutshell, this is what happened with the urea crisis. So back to the Dr. Jones' question, yes, Korea, uniquely have gone through three really nationwide the crisis of the supply chain, and that has been a really big the opportunity to really begin to develop this our domestic the policy framework to cope with this kind of a potential crisis. So it needs a lot of domestic legislation, but also the private-public partnership, etc. But recollecting those urea crises, I think what is really needed is to develop some sort of early warning system in which you really catch early symptom of looming, this supply chain crisis, and then really kind of spring to action. So the key issue is to, as Dr. mentioned, we have thousands of these vulnerable this product that we are depend on one or two countries, and can there be some objective criteria that over 50% or the 6%? I think market should determine, right? We can put sort of numerical, artificial kind of threshold, but depending on the nature of the materials, it could even 20% could be critical, to supply from the global market. So and also how to secure this the real-time really valuable market or business information from the private sector. That is a key. What happened during that urea crisis is that government didn't really realize what was happening in the market until this one business, the corporation, they came to the government and really, cried out, there is something weird going on. So how to make sure that we develop a system in which the private sector and government private sector kind of channel, information to the government, and then, develop this kind of a cooperation system between private sector and government. But there is this privacy or sensitive business information involved. So how to strike a right balance in securing this information from the business, but also making sure that their, the proprietary information or the privacy is guaranteed. So those are some of the policy questions that we have to, the cope with. And this is a domestic dimension, but also we need this international, collective response mechanism. I believe that, the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is kind of developing this kind of policy tool to, encourage this collective response mechanism among like-minded countries. So with that, on the second issue, in the interest of time, energy security. In Korea, I think now it's nuclear energy is a really big priority in our energy transition. But obviously, that's not enough. yeah, of course we have to go for it, but also renewable energy, the solar power and offshore wind power. These have good potential in Korea. I think this Korean government really needs, and also private sector, they need to take this dual approach of the nuclear power as well as renewable energy, not just one or the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Yao.
Yeah.
Dr. Longhoff.
First of all, I probably would start from answering the question which was mentioned but not asked. That is question about North Korean workers. Personally, I would like to make absolutely certain that I'm opposing sanctions on North Korean workers. I believe that claims about North Korean workers to be modern-day slaves are, can I afford to say it, stupid. Why? First, slaves, wonderful. Last time I checked, in the 17th century, people in Central Africa did not bribe village elders for permission to board a slave ship. Last time I checked, people who came back from sugarcane plantations did not save money to bribe their bosses again to be allowed to become a slave once again. But every single North Korean worker in Russia, Middle East, China has paid a bribe to be allowed to go. And don't tell me that these people were misled. For many of them, it was the second and third trip. And every time you go, you pay more for every new trip. A rate for 2015, for your information, we are talking about people whose whose average salary is about $50 a month. Prices were $600 or $700 for going to Middle East. $500 for going to Russia. But if you happen to be unlucky to have relatives in Russia, $1,000 and $200 for China. Why? Because if these people are not allowed to go, they are not going to go back to their wonderful construction sites in North Korea, where they will be protected by famous North Korean trade unions who are known for their militancy, and beautiful Korean labor laws, North Korean labor law system, and everything. No, because these people actually go, they make money which are then invested in the private economy. For the average North Korean, going overseas is the major way to make enough money to get out of the destitution. Basically, if you are just a common person, pretty much the only way. And on top of that, they're exposed to the knowledge of the outside world. And a number of times I have encountered people whose decision to escape the country was essentially a result of their trips to Middle East or Russia, never China. Because in China, they are much more isolated. Having said that, I think it's basically a big mistake, the sanctions. But anyway, so going back to questions. What can the U.S. do to push China? Frankly, I don't see anything. Because as I have said, some kind of big deal, but it's a geopolitical fantasy. Yes, swapping Taiwan, but it's if you say something like that, you became yourself a laughing stock. So I didn't say so. And I understand it's not going. Yes, yeah, but it's fantasy. It's fantasy. And for China, the problem is that value of North Korea as a strategic buffer is way too high, and trust in American promises is way too low. So China will not accept any kind of promises. What are the options of the outside world, above all United States and South Korea, in dealing with North Korea? First of all, deterrence, of course. Second, I would say I would not mind to see a Hanoi-style deal. Hanoi-style deal, that is, North Korea agrees to surrender, not surrender, just physically destroy all known nuclear facilities. In exchange, sanctions are fully or partially lifted. Problem is that I don't see any American administration doing it because of domestic political constraints. Because such a deal will imply explicit or implicit recognition of North Korea as a nuclear power. And, of course, it's a nuclear power. with all due respect to the U.S. Congress, it's not in position to change the laws. It's in position to change the laws of the United States, maybe even Constitution. But it cannot change laws of the nuclear physics. It's above the power of the U.S. Senate. So, because laws of the nuclear physics are laws of the nuclear physics, North Korea is a nuclear power, period, like it or not. But admission is impossible if it's politically. If it happens, any administration which will make such a concession will be criticized, will be accused of being gutless and everything. So even though I believe that such a solution, such a compromise, serves everybody's interest, including U.S. national interests, very well, it's not going to be acceptable for any administration, because domestically they will be criticized, accused of, bowing to pressure and blah, 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 because common public simply does not understand that North Korean nuclear program is irreversible. So it's an ideal, because it's not going to happen, well, deterrence. Chinese views on as South Korea increasingly negative, and it's a mutual feeling. South Korea is also has increasingly, I have always thought that no country will ever be able to be more unpopular than Japan with the South Korean public. China is, according to public opinion polls now, is more unpopular than Japan. And it's funny to see how fast it happened. And the change took maybe 6-7 years since 2016. And Chinese are quite aware they don't like what the South Koreans are doing, and it's a mutual feeling. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Blanco. Ramon?
Yeah, I think I'll take there were two main themes, so I'll take them in order. Like the first one was, why would South Korea, right, want to play such a role? And that's an important question, because I think there has been this shift, right? There were policymakers in the past that were comfortable with this middle ground position, right? And this idea that we don't have to take sides, or we don't have to be too vocal. But I think that has disappeared. And I think you mentioned the generational issue, which I think matters, even with policymakers. Interesting if you talk to younger policymakers or officials, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of National Defense, right? They want their country to be more vocal, right? They have grown a different system, a democratic system, and they think they should be proud of it. And I think this has filtered to older generations. In this case, they have changed their mentality and say, why shouldn't we, right, defend our own interests more vocally? And I think that change matters. And we have seen, the example of China was just mentioned, right? The current South Korean government being very vocal about China in a way that in the past South Korea may not have done, but we have seen the diplomatic spat with China and South Korea answering to China, right? Not simply taking it as a given that it will be criticized and I shouldn't respond to it. And I think that matters, right? That there's this feeling that South Korea should be doing this. We can go into the reasons. I said democracy is an important one. I think for many South Koreans, it matters in their foreign policy, right? But I think, interestingly, and I'm not a big believer in soft power myself, right? I never believed that soft power mattered that much in foreign policy. And I think in the case of South Korea, probably I'm being proved wrong. And actually, it helps to shift perceptions about our country, right? And it's interesting how there are foreign diplomats in South Korea that draw this parallel, right? The growing importance of Korean culture, and politically should be utilizing this. And the second question that you raise is this entirely new? And I agree with you. I don't think it's entirely new. Korea has seen itself playing a global role, and I'm glad you mentioned went all the way back to the 1990s, right? Because it is true that back then, right, when after Korea joined the United Nations, there was this discussion, right? We should play a more global role, peacekeeping and all these different issues. What I do think now is that the environment is very different, right? 1990s, of course, United Nations, WTO was being launched as well. But now we have moved into a world of competition, but also minilaterals, right? And I do think that in these minilaterals, South Korea has a bigger role because it's less countries, right? So if we're talking about Korea, Japan, U.S. trilateral cooperation, Korean voice is going to be stronger than it was an organization, right, dealing with security. Same with trade, right? If the G7 plus, whichever we want to call it, wants to discuss economic cooperation, Korea's voice is more important than it is in the WTO or any other organization. And I think that's a difference actually with a few years ago. That Korean voice is more important because there's less countries working together in different settings.
Thank you, Ramon, for being so concise. Let's, in the interest of time, I want to open things up to our in-person audience and also online. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we can highlight them now. I want to maybe gather a handful of questions, 2 or 3. If you have a question that's for a specific panelist, please indicate as much. But otherwise, I think we have enough interconnected themes here where I think multiple panelists might like to interject. And if the panelist is inclined to say something, please just 2-finger intervention and you can add to it. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you. Mark and then Guy.
Thanks very much. Great panel. Mark Fitzpatrick. I'm a board member here. Both Minister Yo and Dr. Pacheco Pardo mentioned this issue of requests to supply munitions to Ukraine, which have been done indirectly via Poland and lending to the United States. And I'm wondering, first of all, whether you think this response is deemed sufficient, or if you anticipate, as I do, that because the war is going to continue to consume shells at a huge rate, that whether there'll be more requests and whether they might be direct, and how Korea will address this. So do you think that another question. Is there a recognition that this is a part of a shared values of democracy and pressing against responding to a country that's violating norms, or is it viewed mainly as matter of self-interest to Korea that it might help it get into the G7?
And then let's get Guy's question as well. And I'll ask forgiveness later, but let's extend the program by 5 minutes for additional questions, because I assume there may be some.
Thank you. Guy Aragoni, former Department of Defense analyst on Northeast Asia. For Dr. Lankoff, looking for at least maybe a light gray, if not a silver lining in the future that you outline, is a more assured North Korea likely to be more or less disruptive in the region?
Sorry, what do you mean by more assured in this case?
With allies, with the support it's getting from China and Russia.
Do we have a third question that we might gather? Oh, yes, please. This gentleman in front.
Rob Warren. I'm interested in your analysis of the relationship with China and Russia at this time and how this impacts on North Korea. The thing that I find amazing is that China is unwilling to criticize the Russian invasion.
Okay, let's start with Mark's question about arms to Ukraine, rock arms to Ukraine.
Okay, I'll connect first. Yes, of course, the Korea has been at a war. 70 years ago. Coincidentally, this is the 70th year anniversary, of this Korean armistice agreement at that time. So I think this is, Korea is joining this international coalition because of the shared values of the democracy and free world. But I think the sticking point here is that Korea also is facing, North Korea threat. And the Russia is openly kind of threatening that in case of Korea's direct, supplies to this Ukraine, the consequences, what kind of consequences could be. So I think, yes, assuming that the war will, continue to, drag on and more and more tragic humanitarian crisis will be seen, I think Korea may need to step up, from where we are now. But the critical issue is we also need to kind of discuss this contingency. What kind of consequences that the Russia could bring in relation to Korea's, the relation with North Korea. So I think we have the better expert than I do to provide the answer to this question. But I think U.S. and Korea and Europe, I mean, in order for Korea to provide direct their arms sales to Ukraine, I think this matter needs to be also seriously discussed among these like-minded partners.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question because when we have the discussion back home, right, in Brussels, for example, right, the question is not whether Korea is going to provide munition or weapons. It is, right. The question is really whether it's going to do it directly or not, right. But when you talk to policymakers, it's not such a big issue for them because it's not going to go directly to Ukraine. It's going to go through Poland anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So it's more the political point of saying, look, this is going to Ukraine, than the practical point because the delivery is going to go through Poland, right? Now the Baltic states are also talking about providing a second route. I don't know exactly how it will work, of course, but they have been discussing this. So in Brussels, there are meetings, for example, between Poland, the Baltic states, the U.S., Japan, and Korea to discuss this type of more logistical matters. Some of them have been reported, not the contents, but the fact that the meeting took place. And it was very interesting because when Secretary General Stoltenberg, when he went to Seoul, and he made the point, he was asking for direct support for Ukraine, right? But that wasn't shared across NATO. It was very much his personal view of the importance of the direct, and also because he's about to leave office, as you know. So I do it freer to speak his own mind, right? Many other European countries, especially Central Eastern Europe, they don't see this as a big issue, right? They say, well, Korea will continue to deliver. It has more and more agreements with different countries in the region, especially in Central Eastern Europe. So more weapons and ammunition as well are going to make their way. And a very last point on this matter, that there was a very interesting discussion in Europe recently because to the European Peace Facility, right, the instrument that the European Union has to deliver weapons to third parties, there was a fairly open discussion about whether to use this to buy Korean munition, right? Because these facilities to provide weapons to third parties. So you cannot say this is for Poland. No, this is for Ukraine, and it's quite obvious, right? But it was some European countries, such as France, for example, that said, no, this should only be used to buy from within the European Union, right? Not even the UK, for example, from within the European Union. But other European Union member states were saying, well, why don't we buy from Korea? They already have it there, right? So even within Europe, there are divisions as to whether the degree of cooperation that should be with Korea on this in this particular area should be done through the European Union, through NATO, or on a bilateral basis. And I think we have settled for the bilateral basis. As I said, for many European countries, the direct, non-direct it's not really something that is being discussed. It's more about the weapons will continue to flow and the ammunition, and that's fine.
Thank you, Ramon. Dr. Lankoff, is a more stable, comfortable North Korea a more destabilizing or nicer North Korea?
Well, I believe that initially probably more stable, because it's one of the possible explanations why North Koreans have not done nuclear test is China and Russia pressure. Maybe not only, but it looks like the case. Of course, there might be other reasons, but in the long run, if they have sufficient kind of certainty about domestic stability, well, they are likely to become more provocative and bold, because we are, among many other changes over the last few years, we have seen something which I would describe a switch in North Korean nuclear program from largely defensive to increasingly offensive. Because they were developing it as a deterrence, and now they're basically developing a CBM to blackmail Americans, make sure Americans would not get involved in the Korean War. It's a second Korean War, and tactical nukes to ensure that they would basically annihilate South Korean army in spite of all their fancy, expensive, high-precision conventional weapons. So basically, and it seems that they're still dreaming about conquest of the South. I don't think they will ever do it, but this is something they are dreaming about. So,
And then the final, I think, generally addressed to the panelist question about Russia-China relations. Why has China not condemned Russia's behavior? I think anyone who wants to respond to this, discuss this as well.
It was about North Korea specifically, or in general?
I don't want to put words in the gentleman's
Yes. Maybe Andrew, because it's about North Korea. So you will know
Why
it.
should they? Why should they? They obviously think about Taiwan liberation. And after all, recently, about a month ago, the Chinese ambassador in France, who is known one of these warrior, how would you say, lonely wolves, warriors. Yes, yeah. I suddenly even switched to Russian automatically. Wolf in Russian is wolf. Yeah, sounds very similar to English because in the European. Anyway, so one of these wolf warriors, a French ambassador, Chinese ambassador to France, even said that borders between former Soviet states, former Soviet republics, now independent states, are not fully internationally recognized, so they are not real borders. So why should they basically condemn? And finally, Chinese approach to the international politics is very pragmatic. Frankly, everybody's approach is quite pragmatic, but China is a bit of outliers, very pragmatic.
Thank you, Dr. Lonkov. Obviously, we could continue to discuss this from many angles, but I just want to close by thanking all of our authors and speakers today and our discussants as well for their thoughtful commentary. KEI is putting on an event next Wednesday, which will also be hybrid, about trilateral U.S., Japan, South Korea relations and integrated deterrence, a concept that is, I think, still a little understood. And so we're going to explore what that means, not just from the U.S. perspective, but from allied perspectives as well. And also, please stay tuned for future programs related to Korea policy, including Volume 2, which focuses on different countries' Indo-Pacific strategies, as well as the issue of how the alliance relates to a potential Taiwan contingency, written by yours truly. And lastly, for those here, we have lunch outside ready to go. So please enjoy the meal as we network together. Thank you again, everyone.